Guys, so just like labor market, unemployment is also an important topic. Labor market is an important topic in micro. I feel unemployment is a major important topic in macro. We need to prepare both micro and macro labor market and unemployment. I feel sometimes they can come together, but hasn't happened really a lot in the past. So basically, when you look at unemployment, how do we define somebody who's unemployed? And we say this that an unemployed person is one who is of working age, basically, which means basically if your country has a working age of 16 or 18, so of working age, 18 to 65, but who are without work, but who are willing for work at current wage rates. So they are willing to work and they are without work. So that's an example of somebody or definition of somebody who is unemployed. So when you look at unemployed guys, the definition of unemployed can be explained through some data also. So I have a data of Pakistan, which is a dated sort of data, not that recent, but in Pakistan, total adult population was 90.532, of which employed are like 47.54. Basically, people who are willing to work and are actually working. Then you have unemployed who are basically willing to work and are unable to work. And this includes basically 10 to 14 age group as well. And not in labor force is basically 40.52. Now, not in labor force basically are people who are uh, of basically who are willing to work, but I mean, who are not willing to work, but are adult population. So for us, basically, the first thing we need to understand is that if you are qualified or if you're called unemployed, you are willing and able to work and unable to find work. So that's an important thing to understand. So when you look at unemployment rate of Pakistan, the unemployment rate we say is calculated through. Let me write this again. Unemployment rate is calculated through total unemployed over your labor force, total labor force time 100. Now, what is labor force? We say labor force is basically your working population uh, or people who are employed plus unemployed. So you add these two together and you get your labor force, and therefore your labor force is 47.55 plus 2.47, which is basically 49.98. And the unemployed, of course, is the employed is 47.54, but unemployed is your 2.47. So 2.47 of the 49 times 100, which means your unemployment rate is 4.84%. So, guys, your unemployment rate becomes 4.84%. Uh, Now, this seems like a lower number, right? Because what we have is basically there are people not in labor force but are willing and able to work. And who are these people not in labor force? This could be women who are not deciding to work. This could be you who might be a college student and therefore not working. It could be anyone who can work but is not working. So if you look at that number, we don't include this number because this is basically people who are not willing or able to work. Okay. Now, guys, then comes your participation rate. Like how much of your labor force is participating when it comes to your total population. And if you look at this number, the number is 49.98, which is your total uh, working population or labor force divided by adult population, which is 90.532, and you look at 55% of our population is basically participating. Now, this number, one would argue this is pretty low, given the women participation in the labor market is low. This number should have been like 70% or 75% and so on. But given our women participation in the labor market is not high, we may feel this number is low because higher participation rate could also lead to lower what we call dependency ratio. What is dependency ratio? Basically, dependent population is basically your population that is between 0 to 15 or above 64 and they are basically those who we do not require too much. So if you're retired, guys, if you're retired, or you are under 15, you are basically should not be working according to the laws, and therefore that's your dependent population. It's dependent on basically those who are working. So those who are working, or rather those who can work, if I may say. So those dependent population therefore will be basically, if you look at Pakistan's total population is 160 million, right? This is when Pakistan's population was 160 million. Minus, I'll subtract this 90 million. So I'm looking at 70 million people in the country who are basically not required to work depending on their age. So of the 70 million divided by total population, adult population, those who are working, that's 90. And it's a ratio. So dependency ratio turns out to be 0.78 is to 1. Now, what does that mean? Basically, for every one person who can work, he has to support almost 0.78 of a person. Now, this means Pakistan's dependency ratio is really high because a large population of Pakistan is either too young or too old to work. Makes sense. 70 million is a large number, and we have a large 0 to 15 population, of course, which is a problem. Makes sense, guys. So some of these numbers, just to understand, this used to be in the AS, but it moved away now to A2. So now we have this in A2. Any questions before we move on? Okay, guys, awesome. Now moving on, guys. So how do we calculate unemployment? Well, there are two ways of calculating unemployment. One is a very basic or non-technical kind of a way. Another one is more organized, more extensive. The first one is what we call claimant count. Claimant count is basically figure out how many people are claiming unemployment unemployment benefits. Those who are claiming unemployment benefits are basically those who are unemployed to begin with, and that can actually simply be your number of people who are unemployed. Yes, it's you have a question. Just please quickly shoot. Give me know. Let me know what your question is. Yeah, please unmute yourself if you can. Yes.
सर मेरा क्वेश्चन ये था कि आपने बोला कि जो अनएम्प्लॉयड में जो रेशियो है वो दैट इंक्लूड्स 10 and 14 एज ग्रुप, बट डिपेंडेंसी रेशियो में जो है वो 0 to 15 इयर्स आती है.
या
तो इससे तो बाकी रेशियो चेंज हो जाएंगे ना, क्योंकि जो ये 10 to 14 एज ग्रुप है वो.
Yeah, so problem is this, that the data that I have here included 10 to 14 age group actually. So the problem that I'm having here is that the data that we have here did not actually provided us 15 and above. Sadly, this data is taken from Pakistan's sort of data, which wasn't able to give us uh, 10 to 14 should have not been part of this. So I agree with you. That's your comment. Makes sense, Maritza? Are we going to move on? So yes, you're right. This shouldn't be included. This should have 15 plus. Okay, are we going to move on? I guess that's a yes, right? Okay, guys, moving on. So, guys, so when you look at claimant count is basically simply looking at people who are receiving unemployment benefits. Now, it's very easy to collect kind of a ratio. Simply go to the data sort of team, go to the people who are giving unemployment benefits and just ask them how many people are claiming unemployment benefits, and that's your number. Now, it's too rudimentary and it has some problems. Number one is that I'm going to talk about one problem, but I'm just going to basically first talk about that they exclude those of working age who are available for work at current age rate but are not eligible for benefits. So one of the big problems that happens is this: uh, let's say I'm actually genuinely unemployed, but somehow the rules are such that I do not get unemployment benefit. Let's say I'm somebody who has a spouse working, and because my spouse is working, the government has a law that if your spouse is working, you will not get unemployment benefits. But then that would mean that I will not be included uh, in the in the numbers when in reality I'm actually genuinely unemployed. Do you guys get that? Does that make sense? So the first thing we talk about is this: that it exclude all those of working age who are available for work at current wage rate, but are not sort of who should be, I mean, who are unemployed but are not eligible for benefits. So that's one problem that happens. That a country may have a rule where it may not be providing you unemployment benefits, and despite you being unemployed, you might not be able to get unemployment benefit. Number one. Number two, guys, is this: that if the government actually any year changed the eligibility criteria, making fewer people now eligible, this would reduce actually the number of claimants and therefore the number of unemployed. When in reality, it's just a change of rule. So claimant count somehow is not a good measure because it doesn't really tell you whether you are unemployed genuinely. It just makes you unemployed when in reality you might not be unemployed, and so that could be a serious problem. So, any questions about this? Also, when you're comparing unemployment benefits of different times, also unemployment benefits of different countries, and if you're using claimant count, you might not find it to be reliable because some every country has a different rule as to who's eligible for unemployment benefits. Does that make sense? These are, no, they're not available in Pakistan. So that's actually a very good point as well. What if your country doesn't really give you unemployment benefits? And then if that's the case, then of course this method will not be eligible. Makes sense? Yes, it's them. Please ask me if you have any questions. Sorry, do you have a question? Are we good to move on? It's up. Please ask me the question. I'm unable to hear you if you are asking me a question where, or are you writing? Yes, students who are studying in universities are actually called not unemployed, but basically they will be called not in labor force. If you are somebody who is uh, studying, then basically you're not part of labor force. But let's say if you are somebody who is working, you know, who is willing to work but unable to find work, will be a call unemployed. So students are actually not in labor force since they are full-time students. Make sense? So that's what it is. And of course, they will not get unemployment benefit as a result of that. Okay, guys, the second sort of method is called ILO measure, which is, of course, the most reliable method. In this measure, the unemployed is defined as those who are available for and seeking work while currently without work. So there's a definition: those who are willing and able to work and are actually not working because they are unable to find the right kind of a job. This is a consistent definition. So the first thing is just that when you use this method, the definition is consistent no matter what country you're in. Also, the ILO measure undertakes a very extensive and standardized sort of a labor force survey to figure out the unemployment statistics. So there is a lot of consistency when it comes to using this survey. And that's why it's very extensively used for international comparison, because of course it's reliable, um, as it may include some of the groups which is not included in claimant count. Those people who are actually not getting unemployment benefits are also sometimes unemployed, so it will include that. But the downside of using this method, of course, is that it is expensive, because it's kind of like a large survey which is undertaken. And remember, just like all other surveys, like census and all that, it takes up time and money and so on. And it's also more prone to what do we call statistical errors and sampling issues and so on and so forth. Makes sense, guys? So this is your ILO measure or labor force survey. Any questions about this one? So this used to be in AS, now it's moved to A2. Doesn't really come often, but we need to know this because um, it is the basis for the chapter we're about to do. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to move on to another discussion, which is basically the ADAS curve from a macro perspective of labor market. So when you look at, labor market, look at what is happening here. I have an aggregate demand for labor, all the demand for labor, okay, and I have aggregate supply of labor. Now, when you look at demand for labor, there's this demand may include plumbers, teachers, physicians, doctors, and all that. And supply will also include all the various people who are out there. So when you look at wage rate, we have what we call average real wage rate, and not uh, uh, um, a particular wage rate. Why average? Because we have so many professions. We are aggregating all the demand of professions and aggregating all the supply, and that's why I have a average real wage rate. And why real? Real would mean it will account for inflation. Average would mean it will include all the professions. And on the on the x-axis, I have quantity of labor. How many people are out there? Now, a couple of things I want to talk about. But before I talk about, is there any question, guys? Anything that you have to ask before we move on to talk about this diagram in detail? Any questions, guys? Are we good to move on? Okay, guys, AD curve is downward sloping. Why is AD curve downward sloping? Well, simple idea is that when the wage rate goes down, the quantity of labor demanded goes up, right? So labor becomes more, what you call it, cheaper than other factors of production, and that's why AD curve is downward sloping. So that explains why AD curve is downward sloping. Lower wage rate, higher quantity demanded, higher wage rate, lower quantity demanded. But aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Like this is my AD curve. So that's one thing. But my AS curve, guys, is upward sloping. Why is my AS curve upward sloping? So we need to understand that our AS curve basically is upward sloping because, not only upward sloping, let me write this, it's upward sloping, but also inelastic. Yes, Malik, we can wait. So there are two things we want to talk about. Why is it upward sloping? And number two, why is it inelastic? So let's talk about why is it upward sloping and inelastic. Sure, I can wait. So guys, we're saying a couple of things. Number one, aggregate supply curve is upward sloping and it's inelastic. Why is it upward sloping? Well, simply when the wage rate goes up, more people will be encouraged to work in the labor market, right? So when the wage rate goes up, let me use another. When the wage rate goes up, quantity of labor supplied will go up. So that's one thing. Higher wage rate will attract more people to the labor market. So when the wage rate goes up, you will see your quantity of labor supplied to go up from QE to Q dash, for example. Number one is that. Number two, guys, is the idea that, why is it inelastic? And the answer is very simple, that supply curve is inelastic because we're looking at the labor market of the whole country, right? So it's inelastic because the size of the labor force at any point in time cannot change significantly. You cannot have many people coming into the labor market suddenly. It's a very inelastic curve, which is not that responsive to a change in wage rate. Okay. And it's not totally inelastic because when the wage rate goes up, you will see some people to come to the labor market. More people will be like, you know what, why sit at home when the wages are really high? The opportunity cost is really high. But it is relatively inelastic because you can't really add significant number of people when the wage rate goes up. Also, the unemployed will be more willing to accept jobs rather than continuing to search for a better job when the wage rate is high. Let's say I'm looking for a better job, and my better job could be not only because the salary is better, but also because the kind of work is better. But given the fact that I am you know if I don't find the work that I'm looking for, but the wage rate goes up, I'm very likely to accept it because the wage rate was another factor that attracted me to the job. So one could argue this, that aggregate supply curve is A, upward sloping, and B, it's inelastic, which means it doesn't really change that much. Got it, guys? Any questions about aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve? Are we good to move on? Okay, the next point I want to talk about, and it's an important point, we didn't talk about this curve called the N curve. Okay, the N curve is basically a curve that we draw, and we say this is my total labor force curve. And I want to draw the diagram now quickly, separately first to show you what is happening here. So guys, if this is my aggregate demand curve, this is my aggregate supply curve, this is my wage rate, and this is my quantity of labor demanded. So at the going wage rate, these are the people who are willing and able to work and are also employed. Okay, so total employment is Q, let's say L. Okay, so this is my average real wage rate, and this is my quantity of labor, right? But there must be people who are willing and able to work at the going wage rate, but unable to find work. So we make what we call a curve called the total labor force curve, which is something like this. And the curve is such that the gap is actually widening. The gap is widening at the lower wage rate, but the gap shrinks as the wage rate goes up. Now, this curve is called what we call N curve, which is my total labor force. I want to explain the idea. So at the equilibrium wage rate, these are the people who are working, but these are the people, let's call this A to B. These are the people, and let's call this Q total, who are basically A to B, or Q total minus QL, are people who are willing and able to work, right, but unable to find work at the equilibrium wage rate. So the equilibrium wage rate has some people, or at WE guys, what we say is that Q total are the people who are basically uh, willing and able to work, right? While QL are the people who are willing and able to work and are working, while Q total minus QL are people who are willing and able but unemployed. Okay, UE means unemployed. And these are the people, guys, these are the people who we say are basically unemployment, or rather, we say A to B is what we call equilibrium unemployment. So there are some people who at equilibrium are unemployed, and that's these A to B people. And that's why this is my total labor force curve. While this is my total labor force curve, there are some people who are at equilibrium who are actually unemployed. And who are these people who are equilibrium unemployed? Basically, those who are willing and able to work but unable to find the right kind of work. Any questions, guys? Any questions before we move on? Are we good to move on? Other than Zamin, is there anyone else who has a question before we move on? Shrinking, and the answer is this: the gap is shrinking between these two curves. The gap is shrinking between the two curves, guys, because as the wage rate goes up, what we see is this, that more people will be willing to accept jobs. So for example, if I just look at a wage rate, like for example, higher wage rate, let's say W1. If you look at W1 higher wage rate, this gap is very small. Why? Because more people will be accepting jobs despite them not to be in their favor. For example, let's say at equilibrium, you know, you found a job of working in a factory. You'd be like, you know what? I've done a degree from a very good university. I'm not going to work in a factory because the work isn't my type. But if the wage rate goes up, you might actually end up settling for the factory job because the wage rate is attractive for you, even though the work might not be. Make sense? So as the wage rate goes up, we say the gap between these two curves are going to shrink as more people will be willing to accept the work. Right now at equilibrium, these people who are unemployed are basically those people who are unemployed because they either do not like the equilibrium wage rate, the wage rate isn't really attractive, or the work isn't attractive for them to settle for jobs. And that's why they decide to be sitting at home. Will the value of equilibrium negative as value of B will be greater? No, my friend, why would it be? The gap is, let's say this is 50, this is 30, the gap will be 20. If this is 50 minus 30 will be 20. So the gap won't be equal. Guys, so A to B is my equilibrium unemployment, but I want to show you something else. There's also something called disequilibrium employment. So for example, suddenly if the wage rate goes to W1, right? If the wage rate goes to W1, there's also this gap CT. Why is this gap CT happening? Because at wage rate W1, because the wage rate goes up, only C will be the number of people demanded, but D will be the number of people supplied, right? More people will be wanting to work, but because the wage rate goes up, C will be what we call the number of people who are sort of willing to are demanding jobs. So CD is what we call disequilibrium unemployment. And I'm going to talk about why equilibrium and disequilibrium happen tomorrow. But the idea goes this, that there are two kinds of unemployment we can look at. Number one is unemployment at equilibrium, which is this gap AB, the gap between the total labor force versus aggregate supply of labor. Then there is a gap CD, which is the gap when the wage rate goes above equilibrium, which means disequilibrium wage rate happens. This CD is the wage rate uh, which is happening because this is the unemployment that is happening because quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded at a particular wage rate. Now, equilibrium wage rate, equilibrium unemployment has different reasons than disequilibrium unemployment. And disequilibrium means the wage rate has gone beyond the equilibrium wage rate. For some reason, we'll discuss tomorrow. Okay. But is there any question about disequilibrium unemployment? Any question, guys? So what is the total labor force curve? Total labor force curve includes basically both employed and unemployed, right? What is the aggregate supply curve? Aggregate supply curve includes only those who are employed and actually um, um, employed and actually not only employed, but at equilibrium. For example, if they're employed, then it will be QL, right? So the difference between aggregate supply of labor and total labor force will be basically all those people who are willing and able to work but unable to find work, and or unable to work in a particular job. Make sense? Does that any questions about that? I mean, if the wage rate goes really, really high, maybe yes, maybe very few people, but there will always be some kind of equilibrium unemployment. It could be really small, but there could always be unemployment that will happen uh, because someone might not be happy with the kind of work that is out there. Make sense? So when you look at this total labor force curve, I just want to quickly look at this. Even when the labor force is in equilibrium, not everyone looking for work will be employed. Some people will be unemployed. For example, some people will hold out, hoping for a better job. The curve N shows the total number of total number in the labor force, and the horizontal difference between it and the aggregate supply curve of labor represents the excess of people looking for work over those who are actually willing to accept job. So those who are willing and able to work but are not accepting job will be basically this gap. Will be basically this gap. Willing and able to work but are still not working because they don't like either the job or the salary, and therefore they are holding out. And this gap is shrinking because, of course, the higher the wage, the higher the opportunity cost of not being in the labor market. An economy in full employment may still has some employment, and that's called equilibrium unemployment. And I'm going to talk about this, that equilibrium unemployment is basically of people who are either in between jobs, or let's say, for example, I'm an actor, I just finished my movie, right? And let's say a new movie is about to start, but I'm right now unemployed. That's called equilibrium unemployment. Makes sense? So there could also be a reason why you could be, there will always be people who are at equilibrium unemployed. Okay, so the line should never meet. Okay, so QE represents the total equilibrium level of employment, and the horizontal distance DE in my diagram right now AB represents the equilibrium level of unemployment. This is sometimes also known as natural level of unemployment. So this, guys, this gap is called the natural level of unemployment, which kind of like answer it is our sort of this question, which is that will this unemployment ever be zero? And our answer is no. It will always be there because some people are always looking for work. So it's kind of like a natural unemployment. It will always stick around. Makes sense, guys? Any questions? So guys, also note that aggregate supply of labor curve gets closer to the end curve at the higher wages. And the reason for this is that unemployed will be more willing to accept jobs the higher the wages they are offered. If the wage rate, so this gap is shrinking because at higher wage rate you will have more people deciding to sit at home. And also, if the wage rate is above WE, which means like wage rate like W1, this is your disequilibrium unemployment. People who are unemployed because of disequilibrium in the market. Quantity of labor supplied is more than quantity of labor demanded. Why does it happen? That's a discussion for tomorrow's class. Okay, guys, I am done, guys. I'm going to see you guys tomorrow, and we'll discuss disequilibrium and equilibrium unemployment reasons tomorrow. Thank you very much, guys.